Great. Then Dale Miller has been a colleague for, God, I don't remember how many years, but a long time. And at the planning office in Herkimer, Oneida counties, which is based in Utica, New York. And he's got some wonderful data systems available to him and a lot of experience with doing LUCA. So I'm going to turn it over to Dale.
Thanks, Bob. I appreciate it. If you want to slide to the next slide, Bob.
Yeah.
As Bob said, my name is Dale Miller, and I work for a two-county regional planning office in upstate New York, basically in the heart of the state. We have about 300,000 people that live in the two-county region, and they live in roughly 135,000 residents. I've been involved, again, with the Census since 1990 and LUCA for the last two, the most recent one being 2010. The process then appears at least to be somewhat similar to what we're going through now. At that time, in 2010, we submitted some 17,000 addresses that we felt had been missed in some capacity by the Census Bureau. Eventually, about two-thirds, about 11,000, were accepted by the Census Bureau, and another 6,000 were found to be unfounded. That is to say that they were either duplicative or they had a use change or some other thing like that. And so consequently, we had to go on from there. Slide, Bob. So for me, when I go talk to the local government agencies about the LUCA process, I try to make it as simple as can be. And in essence, LUCA boils down to one thing. It's a comparison of two databases. One being the master address file that the Census Bureau has and plans to use on Census Day. The other database is whatever the locals can come up with. And in essence, that means they have to put together from whatever sources they can find a database which is then comparable to the master address file. It's really a fairly basic process. When I begin to look at those databases, the next one. When I begin to look at those databases and talk to them about the things they should consider, I try to focus on really three things. I talk to them a little bit about the availability of local data. Time is of the essence. We don't have a lot of time between now and when LUCA begins. Obviously, the time to collect and put together this address file is not when LUCA comes in February, but rather well before it. So I try to push them a little bit that they need to see what's available, and if things are going to take too much time, to don't worry about it, forget it, go on to the next thing. In addition, I think they need to make sure to consider the reliability of the data. What was the purpose of the address file that you're accessing? Why was it collected? Was it a political purpose, utility billing? All of those things may collect the information in different ways for different purposes. And then lastly, I try to make sure that they consider the accuracy of what it is they're looking at. The data is maintained by somebody, so who is that? And how often do they update it? These are the kinds of things that I want to try to emphasize to them that they consider when they're building that local address file. Okay, Bob. So for me, in our relatively small region, I tried to basically marry three databases together. I took one which is called the Street Address Maintenance Data, and that is a New York State-specific address file, and it covers the entirety of the state. I'm able to pull out those addresses that are associated with our two-county region, and then our GIS people, because they were already busy with some of this, enhanced it in some ways by making sure that the files that they gave us seemed to match, or at least we could rectify them with some of the other local data that they had geographically. The good part, obviously, of this particular database is that it comes ready-made with addresses. They're pretty standard pieces that you would expect. In addition, they did provide, through the SAM data, that street address maintenance data, some point files. So they would identify buildings and structures based on point identification. That allows a pretty easy transfer again over to our GIS unit. Now, part of the problem with that particular database was that it was measuring and identifying structures as opposed to necessarily housing units. So it would identify businesses, it would identify farms and barns and silos, as well as houses and housing units. So it was a little bit tough there to decide how it is you're going to identify which ones were units and which ones were not units, which ones are just a business and which ones, are something else. In addition, that particular data set had an issue with what I refer to as point dumping. So if you had a large parcel which had, let's say, 150 mobile home units on it, they might have taken all 150 points representing those structures and simply dropped them at the front gate. So they weren't necessarily attributed out to a specific address. Rather, they were just dropped right at the parcel where it entered the local roadway. So, again, that was something which our GIS unit worked on kind of taking care of for me. The second database, and this is one that will be available, I think probably is available in most places, is the real property tax parcel data, your local tax records. And again, because it has standardized addresses, it's a very easy thing to begin to use and to marry into other databases. And within New York State, there's a variety of property classifications that get attached to those properties, to those individual parcels. And those classifications allow things like the identification of a single family home, or perhaps a duplex or a triplex. They also identify apartment buildings as well as mobile home parks, businesses that have an apartment. So there's any number of things that through that classification was helpful. Another little piece that actually has been pretty helpful from the real property tax parcel data has been it also identifies the number of kitchen facilities within a particular structure. So if I have a single-family home that shows 4 kitchen facilities, it makes me scratch my head. And consequently, I might go and take a look on Google Earth or somewhere else if I have to do a site visit and take a look and see, are there 4 mailboxes? Maybe there's 4 gas entrances. Maybe there are 4 electrical entrances. And then I begin to understand that, in fact, this is not what it appeared to be, but rather it had multiple units within it. Part of the downside of real property tax parcel data is that there is, unfortunately, assessor coding error. Sometimes it's not so much coding error, but it's because of the nature of the coding. It's done at a point in time. Subsequent to that, that use may have changed. It may have changed drastically. It may have went from a business to now some sort of a housing unit, or it may have gone from a housing unit to a business. So it's important to recognize that those codes, those property classifications, aren't always correct. And because there is some lag time in getting that information into the books, new builds sometimes lag a little bit, and fortunately there is a process post-LUCA to identify some of that stuff. The last database that I used was the 911 telephone data that we have available locally, and I had to get it from both counties. They operate independently of one another. And I think for probably most places they have something similar to this. And so again, it's a standard kind of address format, and so it's pretty easy to access. Nice part about the 911 data was that it was historical in nature. So they had a lot of data that was from many years ago still in their files. So just because something maybe doesn't show up currently as a house, or that is to say as an apartment, it may have in the past, and who knows, if maybe it's been changed back since then. Part of the problem, of course, with accessing the 911 telephone data is that, well, with people moving to cell service so much, they have a smaller and smaller database to sort of work with. They rely heavily on getting, telephone numbers from Verizon or other telephone service providers associated with addresses. So it becomes a little bit more difficult as we move forward. In addition, in some cases, they are, again, attributing, they are more interested in an address versus a unit. You may have a house that now has 6 apartments in it, but they're not so concerned about whether it's apartment A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. They're more concerned about that it's at 123 Main Street. So there is some concern with that occasionally showing up. Next slide, Bob. One of the things that I really want to emphasize is when you do go out there and begin to get your data together and kind of marry those three, in my case, together, the most important thing you can do is to build a solid foundation by standardizing these data files. Bob spent a little bit of time talking about this before, so I won't spend a lot on it, but you have to make sure that once you parse out those data records into their street, the suffix of the street, the prefix of the street, the numbering of the street, etc., you want to make sure that you go through and begin to make sure that they're all done in a similar way. So is it Ave or is it Avenue? Is it AV? As far as the numbers go, is it 110 and 110.5, or is it 110.5? Again, these are things that you're going to ultimately use to reconstruct that address and hopefully get them all standardized in a very similar and simple format. All right. There are two other real important considerations before I started moving into actually reviewing the local address files. The first rule that I had was delete nothing, sort of like doctors do no harm. I didn't want to get rid of anything until the actual LUCA review begins. Even though I can see or I know that a house has been demolished or torn down or boarded up, I would mark that record in a way that I knew that it had been demolished. But I'm not going to delete it yet because I want to match up and see whether or not it still exists in the Census file, in the master address file. If it does, then I want to make sure to notify the Census Bureau that it needs to come out. There are, it's really, as much as it is about adding addresses, hopefully getting everybody counted, it's also about having an accurate database available both to the Census Bureau and to the localities. So don't delete anything, but make your necessary notes or codes to indicate that something needs to change with this particular address. In addition, what I would suggest is as you build any database file, if you're throwing together more than one database, and in my case it was 3, I think that you should try to give some ranking to the 3, establish some kind of a hierarchy among those databases. For me, the SAM database, that State Address Maintenance Database in New York, was the one that I had the most confidence in. It's the one that, in essence, after we had enhanced it some, I felt as though everything that was in there was pretty darn accurate. So once I did that, I then wanted to look at the other 2. Real Property really was my next best database as far as its accuracy, in my opinion, and then the 911 database, which was a little bit less likely to be spot on. But the point is, once I established that SAM database as being my standard, I can then start to compare the other 2 to it to see whether or not the addresses they have are in it. And if they are, then I know that, okay, that just enhances, or at least it improves my belief that the SAM data is good data. And to the degree that they're not in there, I then have to pass some judgment on, okay, well, what do I have with those, and how do I check to see whether or not they're, in fact, good addresses? Okay, Bob. So, in essence, that leads me to what was the first step I took. Once I had those databases together, once I'd standardized them, now I began to take a look at my non-SAM addresses, in essence, those addresses which weren't in my best address group. And by looking at those and using Excel to simply help identify those that weren't part or didn't have a SAM counterpart, I was able to then assess them based on whether or not they appeared in both the Real Property and 911, which to me indicated it was a fairly good address, whether it appeared in the Real Property alone, which, again, I thought was good, or whether it was in the 911 alone, which was a little bit more iffy. It doesn't mean that I don't believe them. It doesn't mean I don't trust them. It simply was a way for me to score them, to give them some value, so that if they don't show up on the master address file, I now know how hard to fight. So if I know that they're both in Real Property and 911, but yet they're not in the master address file, I think I want to take a look at those. I want to look at those more closely than I probably want to look at the ones that are only in 911. This is just a matter of being able to prioritize my time when LUCA actually happens. In addition, what I did when I had these addresses was I started to take a look at things like Google Earth. So I could go and take a look and see whether or not, one, did it even exist, did the address exist, and two, what kind of a structure was it? In addition, I did searches on things like Trulia, Zillow, Spokeo. These are all basically housing and real estate type sites that helped me identify whether or not there in fact was a housing unit there. So, and remember, even if I went and I looked at an address and I could see the house wasn't there any longer, I didn't delete it, but I simply marked it as something that needed to be considered for deletion when LUCA began. So, the second step that I then focused on was multiple units. Obviously, this is where the real bang for the buck is. Finding those hidden apartments or making sure that the apartment complexes that we have are in fact fully accounted for is incredibly important. And so I went out and identified things through the real property codes in New York, and these are just some of the typical codes that were out there that helped me identify 2-family, 3-family, businesses with apartments in them, apartment complexes, etc. So I tried to look to see those complexes, and then I tried to find modified housing units and also group quarters. And again, a lot of times I had to go out and instead of doing actual site view, go take a drive someplace, I would use Google Earth or something similar to that and take a look and see how many mailboxes were on the house, how many gas entrances, how many electrical entrances, looking for additional doorways and whether or not they had a mailbox next to them. So you can get a lot of legwork done by just sitting at your desk. In some ways, is what I learned. Again, when you find a place that has perhaps 4 apartments, one of the things you want to make sure you do is have at least 4 lines of data, have 4 records, one for apartment 1, 2, 3, and then 4, because that's how the Census Bureau typically has given it to us in the past in terms of the master address file, and that's what we want to match up to. And again, if I wasn't able to confirm that this in fact was a multiple unit, I didn't delete it, I didn't change it, but I did mark it in a way that I know that this in fact wasn't what it appeared to be in the current records. The third thing that I took a look at and tried to focus on, and again, these are all issues of how much time you might have, is I tried to focus on trailer parks, particularly because we're a fairly rural area. And there are a lot of trailer parks, and a lot of them are, I don't know if they're illegal, but they're not well known or at least identified as such. And so in finding them, I tried to make sure that I didn't just count housing units, that is the number of trailers that were there, but I also identified the number of empty lots that were there. Because remember, a lot of what I see, if I'm going to Google Earth, a lot of what I see might have been taken, those pictures, that aerial photography might have occurred in 2015 or 2013 or even 2011 in some cases. So a lot can change over those, 2 to 6 years. And so consequently, if I really felt suspicious about something, I might actually drive out and take a quick look. But again, you can also track down a lot of these through Trulia, Zillow, and other sites like that. The fourth thing that I tried to focus on, and actually this is sort of where I am at the moment, is trying to identify group homes, group quarters, and in particular things like group homes, assisted living, skilled nursing care, stuff like that. Group homes in particular are becoming a bane in my life. If you look at the 2 pictures, the one on the left is the standard model, fairly new, single floor, typical group home for adults with developmental disabilities. On the right is also a home that is for adults for developmental disabilities, located clearly just within a pretty typical neighborhood. So identifying those structures and making sure that they get identified as such is not an easy job. There are a lot of hoops apparently to jump through, and I've been jumping through quite a few of them recently. So I think that it's just important to recognize that it's not always easy to identify group quarters, and it takes a lot of digging to make sure that you get as many as you can, and it's very important for purposes of the census. So one of the things I've been trying to do is contact agencies in regard to some of those, and that has come up as being a little less fruitful than I wish it was. The last step, and this is the one that actually I'm thinking I'm going to get the most help out of, is my plan. Once I've gone through, created this database, standardized it, cleaned it up a bit, done some review of my own, I plan to take the municipal level data, so for one of the local villages, for example, take all of the data that I have, which is my local census address, or my local address file. It's not the master address file, but the local file, and then share that with them and ask them to take a look at it and see what I've missed. I'm going to ask them for any changes or suggestions, things that they may know about that I don't, particularly lots of these small town villages with their main streets have a lot of hidden apartments that, as much as I might have done a reasonably good job of tracking down, they'll know more because they're local. So anyway, I'm going to provide them with copies of their data and then ask them to make changes or suggestions, whether or not they're participating in LUCA. I've encouraged them all to participate. In fact, I've gotten a couple who had initially said no to come back and say yes, that they are going to participate. But in the end, I want to give them an opportunity to look at my data. And once I've done that, I'm going to try to finalize my database for LUCA purposes. I want to make sure when I say that my found addresses equals my found units, again, if I know that there's 5 apartments at 123 Main Street, I need to have 5 entries. I need to have, apartment 1 through 5 all have their own records. And unfounded addresses, ones that I don't think are there any longer, been demolished or changed in terms of their use, I'm going to try to mark as such so that I can get them removed if needed. So, in a nutshell, sort of that's what I've done, and it's in essence something that has taken a lot of individual work, but I'm hoping that by doing it now, well in advance, I can give that out to the locals and get some information back from them, which will hopefully help us have a better count. So, I don't know, again, if there's any particular questions for any of the material. Happy to answer them if you'd like. If not, I'm sure Bob is going to be raring to go.